In the winter of 1876, a trapper descending a remote mountain known as Starvation Ridge found a little girl sitting alone in the snow. She wore nothing more than a thin cotton dress, yet she showed no signs of freezing. She wasn't crying, she wasn't frightened, she wasn't even asking for help. Instead, she looked up at the man and calmly asked a question that would haunt everyone who heard it. "When are the rest coming down?" The trapper assumed there had been an accident somewhere higher on the mountain. He searched the trail behind him, expecting to find desperate families, abandoned wagons, or at the very least fresh tracks in the snow. He found none of them. The ridge above was completely silent. Only weeks earlier, 41 settlers had climbed that same mountain after being promised an empty settlement waiting for them. None of them ever returned, yet the little girl insisted they were still there. Not trapped, not dead, simply waiting. When a search party finally climbed Starvation Ridge to bring the missing settlers home, they discovered something so unsettling that parts of the official record would later disappear entirely. Even more disturbing, investigators soon realized the girl herself wasn't listed among the 41 people who had gone up the mountain. So who was she? Where had she really come from? And why did she keep asking the same question until the day she vanished without leaving a single footprint behind? Let's begin. By the autumn of 1876, Starvation Ridge had already earned a reputation that kept most travelers away. It wasn't marked by towering cliffs or impossible trails. On a map, it looked no different from dozens of other ridges stretching across the frontier, yet the people living in the valleys below treated it differently. Hunters rarely crossed its upper slopes after sunset. Teamsters preferred adding an extra day's travel rather than taking the shorter road beneath it. When strangers asked why, the answers were always vague. Some shrugged. Others simply said the mountain had never liked visitors. Whether those stories were rooted in fact or passed from one generation to the next until they became part of local folklore is difficult to know today. What survives in scattered newspaper references, personal journals, and later recollections is a picture of a place that inspired unusual caution long before the events that would make Starvation Ridge famous. That autumn, a group of 41 settlers arrived from the east, carrying contracts that promised them land and ready-built shelter. They had spent months traveling through difficult country. Food was running low, winter was approaching, and turning back was no longer a realistic option. When a guide told them an abandoned settlement stood waiting on the ridge, complete with stone buildings strong enough to survive the coming snow, the offer sounded less like a gamble and more like salvation. Not everyone agreed. At the final trading post before the climb, an elderly storekeeper reportedly warned them against spending the winter on the mountain. According to one later account, he looked over their papers for a long time before quietly handing them back and saying that empty settlements in harsh country rarely stayed empty by accident. He advised them to build their own cabins in the valley instead. Most of the settlers thanked him politely and continued preparing their wagons. Looking at their decision now, it is easy to imagine they ignored a warning, but from their perspective the choice was almost inevitable. They had families to protect, supplies that would not last another journey, and written assurances that homes were waiting for them. Against all of that, an old man's uneasy feeling must have seemed like little more than local superstition. By the last week of October, the caravan reached the ridge. What they found surprised every member of the party. The settlement was real. Stone buildings stood exactly where they had been promised. Their walls showed remarkable craftsmanship, unlike anything the settlers had seen elsewhere in the territory. The blocks fit together with unusual precision, and despite appearing weathered by many winters, the structures remained remarkably intact. The largest building stood near the center of the clearing, a long stone hall with unusually tall entrances that gave the entire place an unsettling sense of scale. No one could explain who had built it. No county survey listed the settlement. No nearby family claimed to know its history. Even more curious, there were no obvious signs of abandonment. Dust had settled over the floors, but the buildings themselves seemed almost ready for occupants, as though the people who had constructed them had expected someone else to arrive one day and simply continue where they had left off. For exhausted travelers facing their first mountain winter, it looked like extraordinary luck. History is filled with moments where relief arrives at exactly the right time. Sometimes, however, The thing that appears to be a rescue only reveals its true nature much later. If you enjoy exploring forgotten historical mysteries and the questions history still can't fully answer, my book, The World We Inherited, expands on dozens of stories like these with photographs, maps, and research notes. The link is in the channel bio, and you can also scan the QR code on your screen. Within days, the settlers had unpacked their wagons, assigned families to individual buildings, and begun preparing for winter. Smoke should have been rising from every chimney before long. Instead, before the first heavy snowfall had completely sealed the mountain trails, something happened on Starvation Ridge that would leave the settlement silent. And weeks later, the only person to come back down was a little girl who insisted everyone else was still waiting above. For nearly 6 weeks, nothing unusual was reported from Starvation Ridge. That, at least, was how the story appeared to everyone living below the mountain. Winter had settled over the territory earlier than expected. Heavy snow buried the trails, making travel almost impossible, and isolated settlements often disappeared from view until spring. Families learned long ago not to expect visitors once the passes closed. A cabin that went quiet in December usually meant nothing more than people staying indoors, conserving food, and waiting for warmer weather. No one in the valley had any reason to think the 41 settlers were experiencing anything different. Then, on the morning of December 9th, everything changed. A trapper named Aldous Finch was making his way down the North Trail after checking his winter trap lines. According to the account most often repeated, he first noticed something unusual long before he reached the girl herself. There was only one set of fresh tracks in the snow, small footprints, bare feet. They began somewhere higher on the ridge and continued steadily downhill without ever wandering from the trail. Finch later said what unsettled him most was not that a child had crossed the mountain barefoot in winter. It was that there were no larger footprints beside hers. No adult, no wagon, no sled, nothing. He followed the tracks around one final bend. There, sitting quietly beside the frozen trail, was a little girl. She appeared to be no older than 9 years old. Her dress was far too thin for the weather. Her hands showed no signs of frostbite. Her face wasn't red from the cold. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She simply looked up as though she had been expecting someone to arrive. Finch immediately removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Before he could ask a single question, the girl spoke first. "When are the rest coming down?" Finch assumed there must be survivors somewhere farther up the mountain. He turned immediately and scanned the ridge behind him. Nothing. No smoke drifting above the trees. No voices carried by the wind. No movement between the pines. Only fresh snow stretching toward the summit. He asked the girl who she meant. She answered so calmly that years later, several versions of the story described the moment almost exactly the same way. She said they were all still in the hall. They were waiting. Finch asked if anyone was hurt. The girl shook her head. No. He asked whether they needed food. Again, she shook her head. They're waiting. The answers made no sense. As they began walking toward the valley, Finch tried repeatedly to learn her name, where her parents were, and how she had survived alone on the mountain. Every question eventually circled back to the same reply. When are the rest coming down? By the time they reached the nearest way station, word had already spread that someone had finally come back from Starvation Ridge. People rushed outside expecting news of the missing settlement. Instead, they found only a silent child who seemed strangely unconcerned that 41 people had apparently vanished without a trace. The keeper of the station brought her inside, warmed her beside the stove, and searched the original settlement records for her family's name. One by one, every family that had climbed the mountain was accounted for, but the girl's name appeared nowhere on the list. She wasn't the daughter of any of the settlers. In fact, according to every surviving record connected to the expedition, she shouldn't have been there at all. Yet she continued repeating the same sentence with quiet certainty. They're still waiting. And for the first time, the people listening began to wonder whether the real mystery wasn't what had happened to the 41 settlers. It was who this little girl actually was. The search party left for Starvation Ridge on the 14th of January. The first morning, the weather finally allowed anyone to make the climb. 11 men volunteered. Some had known members of the missing settlement personally. Others simply believed no family should disappear without someone trying to bring them home. They carried enough food for several days, spare blankets, lanterns, ropes, and 2 sleds, expecting they would almost certainly be bringing bodies back down the mountain. No one expected the settlement itself to still be standing. Yet by late afternoon, the first roofs appeared through the trees exactly where the settlers had described them months earlier. Nothing had collapsed, nothing had burned. The buildings looked almost untouched by winter. As the men walked into the settlement, the silence became the first thing they noticed. Not the ordinary silence of snowfall, a deeper silence. No dogs barking, no livestock, no axe striking wood, no children, no voices echoing between the stone buildings, only the sound of boots pressing into fresh snow. One by one they entered the houses. Inside, everything looked strangely ordinary. Tables had been prepared for meals that were never eaten. Bowls still sat where someone had left them. Blankets remained neatly folded. Children's toys rested against walls exactly where they had been placed. Nothing suggested panic, nothing suggested violence. It looked less like a place abandoned during a disaster, and more like a place where everyone had stepped outside at the same moment, expecting to return within minutes. The men searched every building. They called every settler's name. No answer. The largest structure stood near the center of the settlement, the long stone building everyone simply called the hall. When they pushed its heavy doors open, several later accounts agree on one detail before any other. The hall was warm, not hot, not comfortable, just warm enough that every man noticed it immediately. Outside, the mountain lay buried beneath weeks of snow. Inside, the stone floor carried a faint heat that seemed to rise from somewhere below. The fireplaces contained nothing but cold grey ash. No fire had burned there for weeks. Yet the warmth remained. One of the men reportedly knelt and placed his hand against the floor. He later claimed the stone felt almost alive. They searched the hall carefully. Along both walls hung heavy winter coats, one after another. Men's coats, women's coats, children's coats. 41 in total. Every settler who had climbed the ridge appeared to have left their coat hanging neatly before going somewhere else. No coat had fallen. None had been thrown aside in panic. They were arranged with almost impossible order, as though 41 people had quietly removed them and walked away together. One member of the search party finally spoke the question everyone had been avoiding. If they're not outside, where did they go? No one answered. Instead, lantern light drifted toward the far end of the hall. Behind a raised stone platform, almost hidden in shadow, someone noticed an opening. It wasn't a doorway leading outside. It wasn't a storage room. It was a staircase. Stone steps disappeared beneath the building and into the mountain itself. Several men later insisted that doorway hadn't been mentioned in a single letter ever sent from the settlement before winter arrived. Not one. It was as though the settlers themselves had either never seen it, or never thought to mention it. The men lit fresh lanterns. One checked the rope around his waist. Another loaded his revolver without saying a word. Then, one by one, they began walking down the stairs beneath Starvation Ridge. By the time they reached the first landing, daylight had disappeared behind them. Only the lantern flames remained, and somewhere far below, someone thought they heard voices. The staircase seemed to continue far beyond what the mountain should have allowed. The men descended in silence, their lanterns throwing long shadows across walls that showed no sign of natural rock. Every surface had been shaped by careful hands, long before anyone living could remember. The air grew warmer with every step, carrying a faint sound that none of them could quite identify. At first it resembled distant conversation, then laughter. Not loud, not threatening, simply the quiet murmur of people gathered somewhere out of sight. One man stopped and raised his lantern. The sound stopped with him. When they began walking again, it returned. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the first to admit they were hearing it. After what felt like hundreds of steps, the passage widened into darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. The voices seemed closer now, but the light revealed nothing except more stone disappearing into the mountain. That was the moment the search party made a decision. Not because they found what they were looking for, but because they realized they had no idea what they were walking into. They turned around. None of the 11 men ever claimed to have reached the end of the stair. When they returned to the settlement, one of the younger men paused beside the row of winter coats hanging neatly along the wall. Almost without thinking, he counted them. Again, 40, 41. Then he stopped. There was one more, a much smaller coat hanging at the very end. It looked as though it belonged to a child. No one else remembered seeing it when they first entered the hall. He reached out and touched the sleeve. The fabric wasn't frozen. It was warm. He said nothing to the others. By sunset, the search party had left Starvation Ridge. They filed their reports. Arguments followed. Some believed another expedition should be organized. Others insisted the mountain should simply be left alone. According to the story, nothing more was ever officially done. The settlement slowly disappeared from local memory, while Starvation Ridge became just another name on an old map. As for the girl, she remained at the way station for several months. She never stopped asking the same quiet question. When are the rest coming down? Then, one spring morning, she was gone. The front door stood open. Small footprints led north toward the mountain. They never came back. Whether Starvation Ridge was the setting of a forgotten tragedy, a legend that grew with every generation, or something else entirely, is impossible to say with certainty today. But stories like this survive for a reason, not because they prove what happened, because they leave behind a question that history never fully answered. And perhaps that is why people still remember the girl who waited at the bottom of the mountain, certain that everyone else was still waiting above.